goes by the nickname Jody. He tells me his mother latched that name onto him when he was 2 or something like that. John Jody Kretzmann, who is co-director of the Asset-Based Community Development, and we just refer to that as the ABCD Institute, a research project of the Institute for Public Research at Northwestern University. What's significant about the work that John and his colleague, John L. McKnight, have been doing, over the past decades is that they are probably the leading progenitors in this country and, in fact, in the world of how to support community-based efforts to rediscover local capacities, and that's focusing on strengths and assets, and mobilize citizens to address problems in their communities. The Institute builds upon the stories and methods of successful community development building efforts in the book Building Communities from the Inside Out. And if you have not read that book, I would suggest you go on Amazon.com and take a look at it. Jody Kretzmann has worked to develop community-oriented public policy at both the national, state, and local levels. He served as the chair of the Neighborhood Planning Committee for Mayor Harold Washington in Chicago. He's been an active consultant all over the world on a variety of projects. And of course, the thing that really ingratiates himself to me is that he actually has an MA in English literature, which is something we share. And he has a PhD in sociology and urban affairs from Northwestern University. So would you please join me in welcoming Jody Kretzmann.
Roger, thank you. That was a very gracious introduction. Thank you. And you also said everything I have to say, so we can all go home now. It's just terrific. I'm delighted to be here. It's a great honor to be president at the 10th anniversary of St. Luke's, and I think even more exciting to be president at the birth of an incredible new initiative that's about to take off for the next decade. I'm really impressed with the planning that's gone into it, the number of people involved in the discussions, and the energy around the core ideas. I'm delighted to be here for a whole lot of reasons. It's nice to be back in the Valley of the Sun on the first day where my town has gotten some snow, so it's always, the timing is really important here. Just a little bit of background. I am a many decades Chicagoan, and I have to say that I'm most of the time proud of it. We're chauvinists in Chicago. We think Phoenix is wonderful, but we like 4 seasons, and we brag a lot about our wonderful neighborhoods, our world-class urban architecture. We brag about the longest publicly accessible waterfront in the world in any city. Do you know that? Along Lake Michigan. We brag about the Chicago White Sox. We brag about the fact that we have the largest percentage of incarcerated public officials of, of any place in the universe, I think. There are just lots of things to like about Chicago. And I want to mention that because Chicago really, for my colleague John McKnight and I, has been a primary classroom for the last 3.5, 4 decades. Chicago is the place that nurtured an incredible community builder named Jane Addams, who invented a tool called a settlement house to put in the middle of a community, and had the radical idea that what we really ought to be is each other's neighbors, and then let's figure out where we go from there, right? And then a few decades later, a really crazy guy from the south side of Chicago named Saul Alinsky emerged and began inventing ways in which to put the wisdom of the labor movement and the wisdom of the mafia together right, to strengthen neighborhoods and build community organizations, right? And then when Dr. King decided that his beloved community needed to break out of the South, the civil rights movement needed to come north, Dr. King chose Chicago as the place to come and see what could be done about building the beloved community in the North. So it's always been, Chicago has been, a place that has taken the community agenda very seriously. And it's been our great privilege to be part of those discussions over many, many years, and really to sit at the feet of people who know what they're doing, who really have creative and courageous ideas about what to do in a neighborhood context, particularly in the toughest neighborhood contexts. And then a couple of decades ago, we began to have the opportunity to move around the country a little bit more and to spend time in struggling neighborhoods and small towns and rural areas all over the United States, really quite systematically seeking out the toughest neighborhoods from the South Bronx to Watts to Liberty City in Miami to Native Peoples reservations all over the country to Appalachian towns where the mines had closed. And we spent 4 concentrated years doing those visits. And we collected, sometimes when I talk about that itinerary, people say, boy, that must have been an awfully discouraging time in your life to go from one struggling community to another. And what I have to report is it was exactly the opposite. It was exhilarating. It was filled with hope. And the reason was, one of the reasons was that we had decided to come into communities trying to find the people, some of whom we already knew, some of whom we were going to meet for the first time, who were making a difference at the local level. People who were creating successful efforts in the face of huge challenges. Where were they taking the parks back from the drug dealers? Where were young people being brought out of a gang context and into the possibility of being a carpentry co-op? Where were elders being involved at the center of life in the community? Where were churches being activated? Where were schools being turned around in tough neighborhoods? And we collected over a 4-year concentrated period over 3,000 of what we started to call hope stories, cases where people were creating a hopeful future in tough situations. We picked the top 250 of them and put them together in the book that Roger referred to called Building Communities from the Inside Out, and tried to be in dialogue with people that we were learning from about what are the themes, what are the lessons, what could we learn if we studied what worked in community rather than what didn't work in communities. And it's those lessons that I want to briefly remind you all of. I think you all know them already this morning. And I think it directly fits in the health in a new key kind of direction. So we're people who've been focused on community, mostly defined by geography, but it can be defined by other kinds of factors as well, by identity factors or inheritance factors or racial or cultural or language factors. But we've been mostly focused on geography. And so it was a little bit surprising some years ago when we at our offices at Northwestern started getting phone calls from people who we thought were strange communicators from our point of view. We got some calls from the American Medical Association, and then the American Hospital Association called, and then the American Academy of Pediatrics called. And this all came about within about an 8-month period some years ago. And we started scratching our heads and saying, well, and they were asking, can we meet with you guys? And we said, we're trying to be neighborly, sure, we'd be happy to meet with you all, but we'd like a little heads up on what you'd like to talk about. What's on your mind? Because we don't know anything about medical care. We're not in that field. And then they got strangely, at that point in time, they got strangely inarticulate. They just said, well, we think we need to talk to you, but we're not quite sure how to frame the questions. So McKnight and I decided we need to do a little bit more preparation for those meetings than we had been able to do. And so we went to the Northwestern Medical School, where they're wonderful researchers. And we told them our dilemma, that we were getting calls from these people, American Medical Association, AHA, pediatrics. And we didn't know why. And did they have any idea about what they would want to talk to us about so we could prepare a little bit, right? And they said, well, we think we do have an idea probably why they're interested in talking to you all. And if you wanted to go into our library here, we've got about 10,000 volumes that will explain to you why they want to call you, right? Well, I only had one life. John only had one life, so we decided we didn't want to do that. And so we asked our friends, could you just summarize? You've read these 10,000 volumes. What did they say? And they were kind enough to put on one overhead what the 10,000 volumes said. They said, the reason that you're getting calls has to do with the answer to the question, where does health come from? What determines whether or not over time you and I are healthy people? They said if you look at the literature, you could probably boil it down, and I think many people in the room know this much better than I, to 5 factors that determine whether or not people are healthy over time. Number 1, our personal behavior. Have we stopped smoking? Do we exercise? Do we eat healthy foods? Secondly, the state of our social relations. Are we embedded in family and extended kinship networks and neighborhoods and communities and parishes that support us? Third, the state of the physical environment. Can we breathe the air, drink the water? Is the food safe to eat? Do we live with rats and roaches? Fourth, our economic status. When we need to enter the marketplace, can we do so in a powerful enough way to get what we need? And fifth, access to therapy. When we are sick, can we get to clinics and hospitals and doctors and nurses? We said if you look at the literature, these are the 5 major determinants which keep coming up time and again. These make sense to you, more or less? You can buy them? Okay. We asked another question then, asked 2 more questions. We said, from a policy perspective, if you had limited resources, could you tell from the literature which of these determinants is the most important? What do you think they said? Shout it out. Yeah. Okay, everybody's saying social relations. Well, in fact, the answer was we don't know. And I actually love it when academics say we don't know. They said, it looks like there's a complex interaction among a number of these, and we haven't sorted out what's the top one. But they said that doesn't mean we can't be helpful to you, because we can tell you for sure what the least important determinant of health is, right? So if you wanted to create healthy people, you wouldn't pay much attention to the least important determinant of health. And of course, you all know what that is, right? Access to therapy. The least important determinant of whether or not you and I are healthy people over our lifespan is whether or not we can get to doctors and clinics and hospitals. Now, it might surprise some people. Where do we spend 90% of our policy discussion time and an awful lot of our resources when we're talking about issues of health and medicine? Turns out we're spending it on the least important cause of health. So what I think we've got in the United States, we've had for a number of years, and this is all the insurance discussion that's going on today, is a really robust discussion, but it's not about creating health. It's about sickness. We have a sickness discussion, not a health discussion. And I think what Health in a New Key is trying to do is to say, let's figure out how to be much more effective in working in these other 4 areas of determination. How do we, in fact, change people's personal behavior? Well, we know from a lot of the research that happens in a family context. It happens in a peer context. It happens in a context where the possibilities for positive change are evident. It happens, in other words, in places where social relations are strong, where the support is there for people to move in positive and healthy directions. The physical environment and economic status are also arenas in which if you can't mobilize a local citizenry in a local community, you're not going to get there. So if our object is to create healthy people, the space in which healthy people get created is the local community. And the primary way in which health gets created is a mobilized citizenry in a local community. Does this make sense? Let me give you one other quick example, and it's also sort of health-related, I think. It's clearer and clearer from a lot of very impressive research that it's not only the outcome of good health that gets created in a local context, but safe communities, we now know, gets created in the same kind of a context. There's a wonderfully interesting set of studies done in combination of the University of Chicago and Harvard that were sort of after the question, if you had a bunch of different neighborhoods and you held a variety of variables equal, what creates safe neighborhoods? Where do safe neighborhoods come from? And what they discovered was that safe neighborhoods come from 2 factors. Number 1, residents who know each other. And number 2, residents who act together in public. It's okay to come off the porch and talk to those young people on the corner. It's okay to act together, to turn the garbage heap into a community garden. And because it was an academic study at Harvard, they had to sort of change the plain English into a more fancy term, so they call this collective efficacy. And what you see once again is a case in which the professional entity, in this case the police department, which is often the start and end of conversations about how do we make safe communities, isn't present in this determination of safety. And good police chiefs all over the country now know this. Police don't create safe communities. That's not what they're for. Mobilized citizens at the local level create safe communities. So I think what we've got in the last decade is a whole increasingly impressive pile of research that tells us that almost any good outcome that we want to reach, we're all outcomes police these days, right? People are always after us about our outcomes. Whether it's health, safety, families that thrive, young people that thrive, elders who are honest, an economy that's vibrant, that almost all of those outcomes have along the way the idea that a mobilized community is the way to get there, that you can't get to the outcomes we want without mobilizing the community. So I think we've got a better research base now than we did a decade ago for why Health in a New Key is such a timely and I think groundbreaking kind of effort. For many, many years, we've been trying to understand what gets in the way. What are the major obstacles facing communities who want to produce good outcomes? What's the problem here? And of course, the problems are many. The challenges are many. You'll face them as you go into the new key. For us, though, we keep coming back to a central one. And for me personally, it was codified most powerfully by a wonderful teacher that I had. She died now about 6 years ago, and so I'm trying to sort of keep her name alive because she was so important in my life. Her name was Mrs. Edna Johnson. She was an African-American woman who lived in the South Bronx in New York City for 50 of her 84 years, the last 50. Mrs. Johnson was in the middle of what was, some of you are old enough to remember when the South Bronx was the neighborhood where it was, if it's broken anywhere, it's broken worse in the South Bronx. So South Bronx was the place that lost 130,000 jobs over a little over a decade. South Bronx was the inventor of this wonderful practice called arson for profit. Do you remember arson for profit? Where the last act of a slum landlord before completely milking the tenants of the building and forcing them out, the last act was to hire a torch and burn the building for the insurance, right? That's where that practice started. But Mrs. Johnson, in the midst of all this, was one of those people, I hope you know many of them, I think probably many of them are in the room here, who was always at the center of the activities that were producing hope stories. So if there was a park being taken back from the drug dealers, Mrs. Johnson was somewhere in the mix, putting people together, trying to figure out how to put a lemonade stand right in the middle of the drug dealers' part of the park, right? If there were kids who were sort of being brought into the community life and out of the gang life, Mrs. Johnson was there. I visited her many times, and she introduced us to these kinds of stories. And I remember after visiting one of these stories, it was the sort of invention in New York City of the thing that's now national called Youth Build, where young people do get carpentry skills and rehab dilapidated buildings in neighborhoods. She had just showed me the first chapter of that in New York City that she was involved in founding. We were sitting on her porch, and I said, I want to once again say how excited I am about seeing some of the work you're doing, but I want to ask you a different kind of question. I don't know quite what motivated me to do this, but I said, I want to ask you, even with all this good stuff happening, it's still the South Bronx. It still looks like it's a bombed out place. And I said, what happened here? How do you explain, Mrs. Johnson, the causes of the devastation that still defines an awful lot of the life in the South Bronx? She paused for a long time, probably close to a minute. There was a silence on her front porch. And I think what she was doing was scrolling through all of the correct answers to that, right? The job loss, the The institutional collapse, the fact that the criminal justice system produced more criminals than justice, the fact that the school system made people dumber, the fact that all of the public systems were broken in some serious, serious ways in the South Bronx. She was thinking about that. I think she was thinking about the power of racism and the ways in which a changing population had produced a community that was isolated from the center of community and economic life. She could have said any of those things, but she didn't. And instead she said, Jody, the worst thing that ever happened to me and my neighbors in my community is that we got put into a prison. And I was baffled. I said, I'm looking around here. I see a streetscape, varied, but I don't see high walls, I don't see barbed wire, I don't see guards with guns. Right? What do you mean you've been put into a prison? And she said, well, I really don't mean that kind of a literal prison. She had a kind of aside, this was many, many years ago. She said, I think we've got enough of those and we don't need to build any more of those. That was a policy recommendation that we have not followed. But she said, the prison I'm talking about, and this is the phrase that's been rattling around in our heads ever since, is a prison made up of other people's ideas about who we are. Prison made up of other people's ideas about who we are in my neighborhood. I said, that sounds important. Could you say a little bit more about that? And she said, well, what I can do is to tell you what happens to me every week. She said, I'm involved in so many projects in my community that I have to go down to Lower Manhattan to City Hall and get permits and talk to people about supporting the projects. And I have to go out to the suburbs and raise money, visit foundations, visit big churches. And she said, what almost always happens is that I walk into a room and meet a few people. I say, hi, I'm Mrs. Edna Johnson, and I want to talk to you about my neighborhood. And they say, nice to see you, Mrs. Johnson. What neighborhood is that? And she said, I try to say it with a lilt in my voice. I try to say, I'm from the South Bronx. And she says, the lilt never works. The minute I say the word South Bronx, I can see what happens to their heads. Their heads fill up with images and ideas about my community. I said, very few of these people have ever been to my community, but they think they know what it is. And she says, what's so devastating is that all of the images and ideas that they have about my community are of a piece. They're consistent. They're all about our needs and our problems and our deficiencies. And so Mrs. Johnson was one of the first to teach us, try to think about ways to simply portray what she's talking about. This is a neighborhood needs map. It's not a map of a particular piece of geography, but it's a map of the mind. It's what Mrs. Johnson said appeared almost automatically when she said the word South Bronx. Are there neighborhoods in the Valley of the Sun or communities in the Valley of the Sun where if you say their name, something like this appears in people's heads? I know that community. That's about crime and child abuse and welfare, broken families and gangs and truancy over and over. We have come to think two things about this map. The first is remembering how Mrs. Johnson phrased it, somebody else's idea about who we are. That the somebody else includes some of the most powerful institutions in our culture, constantly saying to struggling neighborhoods, your reality is this. It's your deficiencies and your needs and your problems. That's all we're interested in. So when I try to compile a list of the candidates for Cartographer of the Year, Mapmaker of the Year, who draws the needs map, the list ends up with mass media, ends up with funders, not St. Luke's, ends up with government funders as well, public sector funders, sometimes United Ways, and it ends up, usually, if people are honest, with universities, right? Most social scientists write about urban problems, right, or issues. I have to confess I've written about a number of these myself, right? It's what we think is important to know historically about struggling communities. What are your problems? And the other thing I think we have begun to see about the needs map, if that's our only map to reality, is that it has devastating consequences for local folks. Probably the worst consequence, if the only idea, it's not that that's not real, it's just that it's the only idea often that's in play. Probably the worst consequence is the internalization of the deficiency idea, that we've been told often enough that we don't have it, that we start to believe it. Can't possibly raise my kids, I don't know enough. Don't have the skills to enter the job market. Can't possibly join with my neighbors to make the block safe, we don't have the power to do that. And so we start thinking about ourselves as deficient. And once we do that, it's really difficult to move out into public in a powerful way to produce good outcomes. Other consequences. If we don't think we have anything here, we don't turn to our local, our neighbors, our pastor, our relatives, folks down the street to get together to solve problems. Instead, the answers are always out here someplace. The resources must be out there. We don't have anything here. The money comes in narrowly defined categories, categorical funding, which makes no sense at all from the community point of view. Often the money is directed toward professional helpers, not toward residents. We did a little study some years ago in the west side of Chicago where some folks out there asked us to come in and they said to us, we think there's a lot of money coming into our communities to address poverty, but we're not so sure where it's going. Could you help us see how much is coming in and where it's going? At that time, the official poverty level for a family of four was about $12,400. And we tried to take a look somewhat conservatively at the dollars coming into that community aimed at helping poor people. For every family of four, how much money do you think was coming in to help poor people? The answer is about $27,000 coming in from programs. But when you looked at where it went, only about $7,000 was in the control of local residents, where they had some say over where it went. The other $20,000 went some good work, I'm sure, but to people who weren't poor people, right? So when we reported those findings to our friends on the west side of Chicago, one of the more cynical said, oh, well, you just told us what we already knew, that it only takes one good poor neighborhood to support two middle-class ones. Right? Now, that's more cynical than I want to be, but it is a point of view. Let me just say a word about this. We place focus on leaders who magnify deficiencies. When I started in neighborhoods many, many decades ago as a community organizer on the west side of Chicago, I was taught by Saul Alinsky to start finding what he was calling natural leaders. Where are the people who are natural leaders? And natural leaders, people would ask Saul, what do you mean by a leader? And Saul would say, well, it's pretty simple. A leader is somebody who has followers, right? Look for somebody who has followers and can get something done. And those are the kinds of people we found. These days, in a lot of the neighborhoods, people become leaders by virtue of their skill at attracting resources from the outside. And that skill is manifested in the ability to get up and be the most persuasive voice in the neighborhood, to City Hall, to the funders, about how bad things are here. We've got more pregnant teens than anybody else, give us the money. We've got more crime than anybody else, give us the money. Don't believe them when they say they have more crime than we have more crime. So that, in a sense, the leaders we're producing now are leaders whose main skill is denigrating their neighbors, not leading them, right? Figuring out how to paint a portrait of emptiness. And of course, this whole cycle produces not only a poor self-image, but it really does lead to hopelessness. So we have a kind of paradigm here that has been dominant for a long time in struggling neighborhoods. The wonderful news is that with my friend Mrs. Johnson, lots and lots of people have said, that's somebody else's idea about who we are. And what we need to do is to construct our own. And so Mrs. Johnson and others have also taught us to never go anyplace without this. You see what it is in the back of the room? It's the classic half-full, half-empty glass, the cliche, right? And in a sense, Roger did a little bit of this at the beginning. Let me do it a little bit differently. We're now convinced that this half-full, half-empty glass is a powerful metaphor that is true on two levels. Number one, it's true about every person in this room. We are all people who are partly filled and partly empty. All kinds of skills represented in this room. Experience, knowledge, wisdom, commitment, energy, right? But when we get to know each other a little bit, it's also clear that we're all people who have a little bit of emptiness, some challenges in our lives. Our lives aren't perfect. If you had a few hours, I could start the list of my own imperfections and emptiness and challenges and problems. Or I sometimes say, if you really want to meet deficient, needy, problematic people, people who you just want to weep when you get to know them about how bad things are in their lives, come to Northwestern University, and I'll introduce you to my faculty colleagues. John, I'm sure it's not true at ASU, right? No. But at Northwestern, our faculty is a mess. We're at an interdisciplinary research center where we have people from 7 different departments, about 22 people. When we get around the table, you just want to shake your head, right? There are people who can't make a marriage work. One guy's working on his 5th one now. People whose kids don't speak to them. People who are battling all kinds of health problems. I mean, we have 4 in our group now that are battling cancer of some kind. We have people who can't balance a checkbook. Most of them are economists for some reason. I know, probably coincidence. It's just a messed up group, right? But what we do recognize is that basically on a daily or weekly basis, we are part of a vast conspiracy at Northwestern. We conspire together to act as if the emptiness didn't exist, to ignore it, to take advantage of the fact that these same screwed up people happen to be wonderful teachers, good writers, they can frame a research topic, they love people called students. In other words, they can do what it takes to make a university a good one, run, right? I don't know about you, but my experience is that any organization I've ever been part of that works on the same principle. Let's take really messed up people and find out what they can do, right? Create the opportunity structure for that to happen, right? That's good management, I think, isn't it, Roger? The same thing is true of communities. Mrs. Johnson was saying that for years and years, people from the outside, powerful people, authoritative institutions, have been telling her and her neighbors, we know what's important about you, and it's your emptiness. You concentrate on that, you broadcast that, you make that clearer and clearer and clearer. You do needs survey after needs survey, and we will give you resources and money and experts, professionals from the outside. When we know that the same thing is true of neighborhoods, that's true of individuals. That there isn't a neighborhood in the United States, or we're working on all 6 continents, and so we can see it globally, that doesn't have some combination of fullness and emptiness. It's just that some neighborhoods, we've decided to concentrate only on the emptiness. In other neighborhoods, actually, we sort of hide the emptiness and pretend like it's all fullness. Neither path is a path that's helpful. Both parts of the glass are real. Our question always is, the kids ask the question, is the glass half full or half empty? And the answer always to that question is yes, right? The right question, though, for people interested in health in a new key is, which half of the glass do you start with? Do you start with first the full part and see what we've got and how we can mobilize it to address what we don't have, what we need, all right? So that's what we've been finding, so it's really gratifying that with Mrs. Johnson, lots and lots of people have thrown out the needs map and said what we really need to do is to get proactive and serious about a map of the full part of our glass. What have we got here? One of the things that really surprised us as we travel across the country, collecting hope stories and being in conversation with people about what was to be learned from their hope stories, was that we began hearing when we asked them, how did you do this? How did you turn this block around? How did you take this part back? How did you involve these kids? We started hearing stories that reflected what we used in the community to get this done. Started hearing the stories about the same set of resources. So we're now pretty clear that there are 2 things that are true about neighborhoods, small towns, rural areas. Number 1, everyone is unique. There's no neighborhood like any other neighborhood in Phoenix. There's no community like any other community in Arizona. Every community has a unique combination, culture, history, leadership, dynamics. Important to know that. But the second thing, we sort of knew that, we expected it. The second thing we began discovering was every neighborhood has the same set of assets or categories of assets. And we now think there are 5 in every community in the United States. And that finding them is the key starting place for successful community building and community development. This is not rocket science. Let's look at the people who live here and concentrate on ways to be in conversation with them that uncovers their talents and skills. Everybody has talents and skills, gifts. How do we find them? Let's be in conversation. So I'll show you in a little bit an example or two. I'm sorry, I've got a little bit of this early winter cold from Chicago. How do we find ways of systematically uncovering people's skills and talents and gifts? We've been developing with communities now hundreds and hundreds of examples of what we sometimes call skills inventories or capacity inventories or gift interviews or ways that people can get at that. Secondly, every community has some kind of formal and informal, face-to-face, membership-driven, voluntary associations. Block clubs, the civic groups, but also the choirs and the softball teams, all the ways in which people come together without pay to do things they love to do. And it's the critical heart of community, we now think. One of my first and most important lessons as a community organizer was, in the neighborhood on the west side of Chicago that I was working in, I'm never going to get anything done in this neighborhood that I want to see happen if I'm not constantly talking to the 4 women who walk around the block together on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning. They are the pulse of the community. They listen, they talk, everybody knows them. If I'm not talking to them, nothing is ever going to happen in this community. So the associational life, where unpaid people get together to do things, is a powerful, powerful part of the community. Third, this is more visible, there are institutions and professional entities located within community boundaries. The usual way of categorizing them are public ones like schools and parks and government agencies, police, private ones, for-profit businesses, and nonprofit agencies of all kinds. And it's critical that they be at the table too. But we're constantly looking, and this might be one of the real challenges, I think, for the initiative here. How do we, in fact, include those institutional and professional actors? These are places where most people get paid to do the work, right? In such a way that space is left for the other 95% of the people who don't get paid to do the work. Is there space at the table, and maybe even at the center of the table, for associations and communities, and that space not being taken up entirely by the paid players? Fairly frequently, I get called in the communities, and they say, Jody, come in, meet with the community. And I come into a room filled with 30 or 40 wonderful people, creative people, committed people, and when we learn who is at the table, everybody there was paid to come. They may come in off hours, but they're there because of a paid position. And we think that misses 95% of the folks. So part of the challenge is, how do you in fact grow the table to include all of the voluntary associations? Fourth and fifth, evident, every community has physical assets, whether we're talking about urban or rural or small town communities. The land, the buildings, the infrastructure, the transportation, all of the ways in which this can build healthy and vital communities needs to be part of the consideration and the conversation. And fifth, it's I think always critical to think about local communities and their exchange patterns, not just economic with money on it, but all the ways in which people informally and formally barter with each other, do things for each other that produce, consume, and that include local business assets. So we now, to summarize, think that sustainable community development might be a kind of a 3-step process. I think this might fit Health in a New Key. Number 1, find the assets. Lift them up. Celebrate them. Create ways for people to be constantly aware of them, right? Make sure that people in public housing know about the talents and skills of their neighbors, right? Make sure that they know about the ways in which the associations do powerful things in the community already. Secondly, after finding and celebrating the assets, there was some of this in Roger's presentation as well, connect the assets. Bring them together. I think the key work in building healthy communities might be this activity of connecting. We're more and more interested in the role of somebody who might be called a community connector. Where are the natural connectors and where might we create more of them? So, for example, a couple months ago, a neighbor of mine, whom I've known for quite some time, daughter of a good set of friends of ours, who's 15 years old, came and talked to me because she had just found out that she was pregnant. And I knew at that moment that I had a choice, that I could think about Maria in two different ways. I could either think about Maria under the category pregnant teen and give her some advice about where to go for programs and interventions and counseling and help. Or I could think about Maria the way I'd always thought about Maria, which here is a beautiful young woman who has, among many other talents, a beautiful voice. Now, Maria with the beautiful voice, and this is now happening, can be thought about then as a more than half full person to be connected with a local association. So I introduced her to a couple of different musical groups, among them a church choir. And they have now incorporated Maria into the church choir. And she's got such a beautiful voice that she's the lead singer on a number of their musical pieces. And they then have connected her as the lead singer to a recording studio. And the recording studio has begun to talk to Maria about ways to build a kind of an economic base that'll enable her to keep and care for her child. Right? So thinking about Maria with a lovely voice, rather than here's a pregnant teen, and then thinking about ways to connect Maria to all of the other assets in the neighborhood, leads to an outcome, I think, that will give Maria at least a better shot at a full and rich life. So that, and the third step, find the assets, connect the assets. And then I think in lots of communities, we're seeing the third step as sort of how do you tie the connected assets to a shared vision of where we want our neighborhood, our community to go? Where do we want to be in 10 years? And then the question is, how do we use what we've got to get to where we want to go? You'll notice that none of those steps involve necessarily writing a grant for money from the outside. They were all about what do we have here that can get us to where we're going. And let me just underline what's, I think, clear to us. What's the logic here? The logic is you never know what you might want to grant for. You never know what you need until you know what you've got. And we've always had it the other way around. Let's start with our needs and go to the outside, rather than let's start with what we've got and figure out then where our gaps are and what we need from St. Luke's or anybody else. Right? So that's the logic of it. Let me wrap up briefly. I want to just emphasize the point with a couple quick examples of two different ways to look at a human being. So we're clear about this. Because we've been doing this for a while, we get people from all over the country and now all over the world sending us examples. And so I want to show you two fairly recent examples that people sent us about two ways to regard a human being. Here's the first one. This comes from a welfare department in a Midwestern state, not Arizona. And it's the form that the welfare worker is supposed to fill out after her first 20-minute interview with somebody who is starting the difficult path from welfare to work, right? Everybody's working on welfare to work still. And here's what the state thinks is important to know about a person starting that difficult journey. Tell me about your inadequate housing, the limited job skills you have, the job-seeking skills you don't have, your poor work history, how often you've been fired, the recent work history you don't have, high rate of absenteeism, GED and diploma you don't have, the training you don't have. Here maybe as a neutral question, how old are you? Are you a pregnant or parenting teen, a single parent? You've got no child care, you've got job skills, but they're unfortunately not in demand. No transportation, no license. You've got sick dependents. You don't have the right credentials. It goes on and on. You don't communicate very well, do you? You're uncertain about your employment goals. They're unrealistic. You don't have the right clothes. You've got family problems. Tell me about your bad eyes, your bad ears, your bad teeth. Other medical problems. What's your friend? Their family and friends won't be very supportive, will they? History of mental illness, your felony record, how often you've lost your benefits. And then they have the gall to say, please share any additional information necessary for developing a plan for achieving your training and placement goals. Well, I think yours is the right is one of the two right responses to this. It's mine anyway. I either have to weep or laugh. Right? You can't, there's no in between here. And you can imagine the sort of psychological dynamics of this interaction. And I think, seriously, if I'm a 24-year-old single mother of 3, this is probably the 15th time in my life since kindergarten or first grade that somebody in authority in some way or other has held up a mirror to me that says, you're really a pretty worthless piece of trash, right? And I'm afraid we do this to people in our communities all too often, not just to people on welfare, but we do it to people who look different, who speak differently, who have a different language. We do it to kids a lot. We now got dozens of these from the juvenile justice system. We do it to elders. Tell us what you can't do anymore, what your body won't let you do. The good news is that that's not the only form that's getting created, although that is getting created still, I think, in the majority of cases. But communities are figuring out other conversations. Let me end with a quick example, one of my favorites, of a community taking the other part of the glass seriously, the full part of the glass. The context for this is a soup kitchen. How many people here have worked in a soup kitchen of some kind? This was in Cincinnati, Ohio. The major players in operating the soup kitchen were, it's the largest African-American church in Cincinnati, Ohio, pastored by a dear friend and colleague of ours named Reverend Damon Lynch, who just got elected to the city council last week. Pastor Lynch and his lay leaders at the soup kitchen got frustrated a few years ago because they said, we're doing a good thing here. This is an important ministry. We're feeding people. We're feeding over 300 people a night, which is a huge operation. Said, but we're not doing more. We're not making a difference in their lives. People keep coming back time and time again. What's the problem here? Could we do more? And they started asking themselves, why aren't we doing more? And their answer was interesting. They said, you can't make a difference in somebody's life if you don't know them, if you don't have a relationship with them. We don't know the people we're feeding. And then they said, no, that's not quite right. They said, we know quite a lot about the empty part of a number of their glasses. We know that some of them are homeless, some of them are jobless, some of them are estranged from their family, some of them are fighting drugs and alcohol. What we don't know is anything about their fullness. So they took a couple of months, and they constructed what I think is one of the most sort of respectful and eloquent one-page questionnaires around the full part of the glass that we know about. Let me just briefly share it with you. This is the actual form that they used. Same format, one-on-one, 20 minutes, cup of coffee. Thanks for coming over. Did somebody talk to you about, and they called it the gift exchange, what this gift exchange is all about. What do you understand it to be? So they start with the idea that the person they're talking to might have some thoughts, right? And then they give their own. Basically, we believe everybody has God-given talents and gifts, can be used to benefit the community. I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about your gifts and skills. And then they said, before we get started, let me give you a small gift. Let me describe briefly what they did. They had the kids in the church spend a few weekends making gift boxes and the gifts inside. And when the box was open, people saw a keychain. And there was a slogan on the keychain, which I think is a wonderful piece of community building wisdom. The keychain said, your gift is your key to your community. Your gift is your key to your community. So they noodled about that for a couple of minutes, tried to think about what in the world does that mean. And then they went into the questions. And here, it's very interesting. If we were discovering that in community after community, the full part was defined as having 5 categories, right? Here, these folks are saying, if you think about an individual, the full part is defined as having 3 categories. And if we know about those, we'll know a lot about the full part of an individual. And they said an individual in its his or her fullness is made up of gifts and skills and dreams. Gifts and skills and dreams. And then they asked questions. Gifts, their abilities we're born with. What positive qualities do people say you have? So you don't have to brag. You can just report. Somebody once said I was a friendly person. Who are the people in your life that you give to? When was the last time you shared with somebody else? And they got some answers about bottles of wine the night before. That was fine. What do you give that makes you feel good? And then skills. What do you do best? What do you enjoy doing? If you could start a business, what would it be? I love this third question. This is the ultimate vocational question that all of us should be asking all the time. What do you like to do that people would pay you to do? We can find the right answer to that. We're happy in our work. Ever made anything? Ever fixed anything? And then dreams, what are they? If you could snap your fingers and be doing anything, what would it be? And then at the end, they said, we're going to do two things with this information. We're going to build a wall of fame, and we're going to try to use it in the community. When I visited, about 6 months after this process had started, they had done about 240 of these interviews. And I wanted to see what change it made. So I walk into the room. I'd been there 3 or 4 times before. And it's buzzing with activity. It's a room maybe twice as big as this. But one of the things I immediately noticed is that it looks different. That the 2 whitewashed walls now were not white at all. They were splashed with primary colors. And inside geometric shapes, triangles and rectangles and circles, was a person. A person's name, picture, maybe a caricature that one of the artists had done, or a blown-up Polaroid, and then a list of gifts and skills and dreams. So the walls celebrated the people. But the walls also then began connecting the people. So when I got there, they had found 40 people with carpentry skills. And they drew little brown saws next to everybody with a carpentry skill and sort of linked them with other people around the wall that had carpentry skills. And what I learned was that just in the last couple of weeks, 12 of these people had begun meeting together to form a carpentry co-op to rehab burned-out buildings in the Over-the-Rhine neighborhood in central Cincinnati. Right? They found dozens of people with some child care experience at some point in their past. And that explained why in one corner of the soup kitchen there was a kind of intergenerational play group going on. Right? They found more than 60 people with musical skills. And that explained why in another corner there was a 5-piece jazz band playing, made up of people who had been sort of introduced to each other by virtue of their love of music. It was not the best jazz band I've ever heard in my life, but they were spirited. In other words, the wall was a living wall. It was making a difference in people's lives. Under the dreams part, there was often a little note next to the dream. Like a dream would be, I want to have my own place. And next to it, it would say, yippee, I did it, here's the address. Right? So it was not only a snapshot of the community, it was the living community as life was evolving. The second thing I saw puzzled me, and I had to ask some questions about it. And here's what I found out. When they asked folks, what do you do best? What do you like to do best? One answer popped up far more frequently than any other answer to that question. Just far more frequently. Any guesses? Cooking. More than half the people said, I love to cook. I cook a mean pot of chili. After a while, the church folks began thinking about what they were hearing. And they recognized pretty clearly that they were hearing not just about a skill called cooking, but what people were really saying to them is, look, I don't want to be on this side of the table anymore, with you on the other side of the table cooking for me and serving me. Because as long as I'm over here and you're over there, you are fully human. You are a valued part of this community. And I'm nothing. They were saying, I want to come around on the cooking side. And I want to be a fully valued part of this community as well. So when they began to think about what they were hearing, the church folks did 2 things, which made a huge difference. The first thing they did was they went to the volunteers. Said, we need dozens of people to keep volunteering at the soup kitchen, but we've got a new rule. And the rule is come hungry. Nobody just comes to help, cook, serve. Everybody eats. It's an eating community. They got some pushback on that, as you can imagine. But most folks adjusted to it and began thinking about coming to do some work at the soup kitchen and then eating with folks at the same time. The second thing they had to confront was, okay, we can change the rules for the volunteers. We don't want to necessarily change the rules for the folks who are coming in the meal. They would be resistant to that. And so they did a very smart community organizing thing. They went back over their notes. They found the 20 most enthusiastic would-be cooks, and they said, have we got a possibility for you? We'd like you to join us in the kitchen. We'll give you a little training. We really need you back there. Could you be part of the cooking crew? They reported to me that within 3 nights, 19 of the 20 people that they approached had said, absolutely, I'll be there. And had started showing up multiple times a week to be part of the kitchen crew. What happened then, faster than any of the church folks expected, was that other people coming in for a meal to the soup kitchen began seeing their colleagues back there in the kitchen and asking, can I do something? Is there room for me back there too? Or can I help serve? Do you need some help with cleanup? Can I help with the walls? Would you like to have a child's corner? What can I do? Right? What I had seen, which puzzled me when I walked into the soup kitchen, was a room full of a couple hundred, 250 people. And I was looking around, and it was the first soup kitchen I had ever seen where I couldn't tell who was who. Understand? I couldn't tell who was coming in for a meal and who was coming in from the church to volunteer. You know, a couple people looked like they spent the night under the bridge, and that could have been church people for all I knew, right? It's not that clear. But it was because everybody was doing something to contribute. Everybody was part of the action. What I think the church folks had done was to recognize and act on the ironic truth that in almost every case, people who help and serve hold power over people who are being helped and served. And they had decided that that was a problem, and they were figuring out how to, in fact, make a two-way street happen. Everybody gives, and everybody gets. So I think for me, what I began seeing in the soup kitchen has become a kind of micro metaphor for what I think a healthy community is. I think a healthy community is one that has absolutely nobody who is thought about as a problem to be fixed or a need to be met. That's the main way we marginalize people in our communities. A healthy community says everybody's got some needs to be met, and everybody's got some gifts to give. Our job in the community is to find the gifts and to create the opportunity structures so that everybody's gift can be given. That's what the soup kitchen did. And it made a huge difference in reconnecting people to the center of community and economic life. The final thing I'd say about that kind of a vision of a healthy community is that it is really about giving people the possibility to act as public citizens. I don't mean citizens in terms of a legal category. I mean citizens understood as people who come out of their door every morning, recognize their own giftedness and the giftedness of their neighbors, join together and say, this is our public space and we can make a huge difference. We can build a healthy community here. So what it's really about, I think, and this is what Health in a New Key is about too, is at the most fundamental building block level, it is reinvigorating democracy. This is about making sure that 50 years from now, when our children are in charge, that they can say with some confidence, we still live in a democratic country. I don't think democracy gets created in Washington, D.C. or in state capitals. I think it most fundamentally gets created at the community level with people who see their role as citizens as a primary challenge in their life and goes after it with full vigor. If Health in a New Key works, it's going to mean that there are more and more Valley of the Sun neighborhoods where people recognize, accept, and leap into that challenge with their neighbors. That's why I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to hear more about what the plans are. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody, for that inspiring and insightful presentation. We will have some opportunity to engage with Jody and with our presenter / panelist, who we're going to bring up shortly, in kind of some dialogue with you. That is, if everybody stays on time, which is always a challenge. And I think the way that we think about it is to take Jody's analogy of the glass. Whether the glass is half full or half empty depends on whether you're drinking or pouring. And what we want to be about today is, and in the future, is pouring. So we're going to take, we're just 5 minutes behind schedule. So if we can just take a short break for refreshing up, get some coffee, something to drink, and come back at 10 o'clock, we'll get started with the rest of the program.